All right, let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks to Brian for helping put together the agenda today.
Sure.
Brian, did you want to lead this, or do you want me to do that?
I can start out with the first couple items there. So I guess the first thing I thought it would be interesting to touch on would be the work that's being done with the FreeBSD and Linux integration of ZFS. There's some updates for that. So I think, as everybody knows, hope people know, the intention is to have a single repository that builds for both of these platforms that we can test on and cut releases from. So that work is, from my point of view, progressing really nicely. There's a couple months ago, there was a call for testing for the FreeBSD side of things. And I haven't heard back from that yet, but I suspect things are going well there. So the next steps we're looking at are getting the CI set up for the Zol project. So it will actually test the FreeBSD code. And then we'd like to get a pull request open using the FreeBSD changes. So we can get code reviews done for that and get it tested. So those are kind of the next steps people should watch for. So if anybody's interested in watching that work or willing to volunteer as reviewers for that, I will send out the pull request when we have one.
Cool. Can I ask a few detailed questions on that?
Yeah, please. That would probably be easiest.
So in the pull request, it's going to what changes should we expect to see? Are there going to be new files added that would be FreeBSD specific, like files that would only be compiled on FreeBSD, vdevgeom.c or something? And then should we also expect to see changes to existing files to clean things up, or to add ifdef Linux, ifdef FreeBSD? What kind of stuff?
I think all of those things. It'd be great if someone from FreeBSD who could comment on this too. But yeah, the intention is to make it so that all the work was done to autoconf and configure, so it can detect what platform you're running on, and then to refactor the code in such a way that the common ZFS bits are common and don't include any of the platform-specific stuff. And then we have new files or subdirectories of files for the particular platform bits.
Cool.
Does anyone FreeBSD want to comment more?
I didn't do the work, so I'm not in the best position to comment, but some of that is done. You can actually see it in the ZFS on FreeBSD tree. I'll just add that to the notes. So under module ZF, so under modules, there's a new directory called OS, and there's a FreeBSD and a Linux, and basically specific files from ZFS and SPL moved into those subdirectories. So ZPL inode, which is specific to Linux, moved to be there. And the FreeBSD version is under the FreeBSD, or OS FreeBSD ZFS, and has, I think, a completely different name because it's different. And that's where things like vdevgeom.c live, and FreeBSD_sysctl.c.
Cool.
And it's got the autoconf changes. Currently, the way it's architected is all the userland bits are built with the autoconf stuff, but the actual kernel module for FreeBSD, we just added a makefile.bsd, and it uses the FreeBSD kernel module building framework. Basically, the makefile just has the list of files, and the FreeBSD system-wide makefiles take care of the rest.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think that makes good sense. We basically do the same thing on Linux too. We just invoke the kernel build system when we get to the kernel bits. So I think that's very, very similar, which is nice.
Yeah. One of the cleanup-y things that I know Macy was looking at doing was around some of the tunables to make a macro that would make it easier to have it write the FreeBSD or Linux
Cool.
specific bits instead of having, if def FreeBSD create the sysctls, otherwise create the /sys things or whatever.
Yeah, we were looking at that. I think the proposal there was to just create some generic macros that both platforms could use.
Exactly.
Which I think is great. I think the more of this we can refactor out to, obscure those kind of details or hide them away in the platform-specific code, that's great.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, and I'm sure it helps Jürgen.
So at the end of the day, like once this project is complete, what ZFS code would be in the FreeBSD repo versus like being in the repo that's currently on GitHub?
Right.
It's complicated.
Yeah, but in general, it'll likely be similar to it is now, where we will continue to treat it like an upstream and pull copies in. The interesting thing is we might actually end up with both, at least for a while. So there's the version of ZFS that will ship with FreeBSD, but you can also install the newer one as a package.
Okay, so you'll keep the Illumos-based one in the FreeBSD.
So the goal is that FreeBSD 13 would ship with the not Illumos one.
Okay.
But obviously, yeah, we can't. I don't know that the plan is to change anything for 12, but 12
it's too late to change this for 12. This is changing the kernel significantly.
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure it'll make it into 13, to be honest.
Okay. With because it's going to result in ZFS kind of stagnating in 12, I think that once 12.1 comes out and has the required kernel bits to let you use the ports module to get newer ZFS, I think most people will aim for that if they want the newer features. I'm not.
Gotcha. So I guess I assume that you will be copying the code from GitHub into some FreeBSD specific other repo, right?
Yes, likely, but the idea would be to keep the diff to 0 if possible.
Okay, yeah, that was my question. Is today the FreeBSD kind of did that with the Lumos, but then there's a whole bunch of diffs.
Yeah.
Right? And generally, when changes are made by FreeBSD people, they're made in the FreeBSD code. But I'm very pleased to hear that the goal is that there would be 0 diff.
It'll make keeping up easier. So
the way FreeBSD has traditionally done this sort of thing is they take a snapshot, configure it, and put it into the source tree under contrib, and then the rest of the normal FreeBSD tree has links to it to do the build. I expect that's what will happen with ZFS here. Alan probably has a better sense of it than I do at this point.
But yeah, for example, when we integrated Z standard, there's a vendor tree that just says, here's an unmodified copy of the Z standard code. And then the kernel, when it needs it, just reaches into that directory and grabs the 8.c files it wants and compiles them into itself. And so we, if we have some compatibility shims, we keep those files separate so that when it's time to update the version of Z standard, we don't have a big diff to carry.
Cool.
So when we run ZFS in userland, since that may or may not be OS dependent, how would that fit into this tree?
So like when you're compiling libzpool to get the kernel parts in userland, it will either reach into the OS FreeBSD or OS Linux directory to get the bits it needs.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll have to look at how that code is, the CStore stuff is structured. But I think we can build upon that. So under ZOF module OS, it'd be, I'm not sure it'd be a peer there, but yeah, okay. I see a couple of ways we could make that work. Thanks.
And I would recommend, it's Andreas, following the Linux kernel practice of minimizing the if-defs that are inline in the code. So typically, everything is done with compatibility macros or inline functions, so that the code reads, like regular code, because it avoids complexity.
Sorry, it just got a little hard to hear you there. It sounded like you moved the microphone or something.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just out for a walk. No, I was just saying that the Linux kernel practice of avoiding inline if-defs makes the code a lot easier to manage, especially once you get, a cross product of 4 or 5 different compatibility, layers in one place, because it can become very complicated with nested if-defs versus if you have replacement functions, it keeps the code clean.
Yeah, I apologize for a bunch of the mess with the crypto port.
Yeah, I think that is our intention, to try and avoid that kind of stuff. Like you say, it makes the code so much easier to read. So reviewers will be welcome when we get the pull request open, so we can hash out the details.
Cool. And what do you, so in terms of making it the default in FreeBSD, we kind of covered that in terms of FreeBSD 13 or 14. What about the timeline for getting this integrated into the current repo and having that support it and do the builds on both operating systems? What's the timeline for that look like?
So for getting it into the current Linux repo, what is currently blocked behind are, not necessarily blocked behind, but kind of queued up behind, are the fast clone deletion and the log space maps, just to minimize conflicts. So we'd like to get those in first, but it's not necessarily blocked behind that, right? It's just a matter of rebasing and when things are ready. So the intent is basically once the CI bits are in place, which I'm looking at getting in place this week. Chris Moore did some great work for that, that I'm trying to get integrated into the CI. And then once it's reviewed and, passing all the tests on all the targeted platforms, and people are happy with it, I think it can go in. So I would hope in a few months, because it's currently working now, is my understanding. So as long as it doesn't destabilize things on the Linux side, it sounds like you guys want to do extensive testing on the FreeBSD side anyway. So I think all the tests are passing, but we'll have to see how long it takes to get it stable.
Cool. So is that can I put you down for the goal being like around the end of August?
I mean, I think it'd be reasonable to get a pull request open, but I don't really have a great sense for how many iterations it's going to take until everything passes and it's stable. I don't think we really want to merge something that's going to destabilize stuff for people.
Yeah, for sure.
So however long it takes until the tests pass.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm just trying to get a rough,
Yeah.
I'll say end of September.
Having a non-nebulous goal always speeds things up a bit.
Yeah. Yep.
So another thing that I wanted to at least briefly touch on is the naming. This has come up a couple times, mostly from folks kind of outside of the core community. I know that for a bunch of reasons, it's not a great look for FreeBSD to be using the quote-unquote ZFS on Linux repo. And I know that we've talked about making that change, making some sort of change there. I guess I'd like to reiterate that my goal would be to have us have something that doesn't include the name, Linux or FreeBSD, that is like the repo that's being used by both of those platforms. So that could be like, we call it OpenZFS, it could be we come up with some other name. It could be we call it, ZFS on, or we call it like ZOLF, ZFS on Linux and FreeBSD, or something. But I think doing something to put both those platforms on, I think the reality is that both those platforms are going to be on equal footing in technically in the repo and in how we make those changes. But putting them on equal footing in the naming and nomenclature, I think will help us to send the right message to people that are using or considering using ZFS. Are folks on the same page with at least that like broad goal?
I always have been, yeah.
I think it makes sense.
I am too.
Makes sense to
does
leave.
it matter from the point of view that they'll be copying into the FreeBSD repo anyway, or?
I think it matters in terms of how we go about talking about it. Because if we, if we're keep talking about, oh, this change went into ZFS on Linux, and it's basically it's going to a repo that makes it immediately part of both, the Linux version and the FreeBSD version, then I think that's a little bit inaccurate.
Get to the point where we have more than one OS that can run continuous integration from the same sources, then everything I think will be a lot better at that point. Then we can convince the ZOL people and the FreeBSD people to pull from a common repo and push any changes back, because the CI will be able to check any thing that breaks for either one. And then ideally, everyone else, any other operating system will start picking up from that as well. That appears to be an attainable and desirable goal.
Yeah, and that's definitely, that is what this project is doing. So. Cool. So yeah, I think one way to do that would be to rename rename as much as we can of the current ZFS on Linux project, GitHub repo, etc. To some new name, maybe OpenZFS. I guess one perspective that I'd like to hear on that is from Illumos folks, because I know OpenZFS we've been officially saying it's like this umbrella project that is all the platforms together. Although we've muddied the waters a bit by having the OpenZFS repo that's actually basically Illumos. So I guess I wanted to hear from Josh or other folks on Illumos. Would that leave a bad taste in your mouth if we changed the Linux FreeBSD thing to call it OpenZFS?
No, that's fine. I think from our perspective, a few meetings ago, well, probably many meetings ago now, I think I said it. We were fine if you renamed the one that's there already out of the way to make this thing. That's fine.
All right.
I think I would say when you speak of equal footing between the two platforms in the repository today, I would probably give some weight to potential future other inclusions and probably just put nobody in the name.
Yeah.
Right? Because it'll just be easier. If the Windows stuff gets more traction, if OS 10 stuff gets more traction in the future, I think
Yeah.
I think it's our intent to continue maintaining our ZFS code base by importing changes for the time being, at least. To that note, we just got ZFS crypto in.
Woo!
Thanks to Jerry.
Woo!
And a cast of 1,000 reviewers and a lot of people doing testing over what feels like at least years now. So it's I think it's probably finally ready to go.
It has been years.
We're gonna give it a whirl. But yeah, that sounds fine to me.
Okay. Then I think that should be the plan of record. And, in terms of when that happens, I think that when we do that, we should try to make a big deal. The leadership should try to make a big deal out of publicizing that out to the world, like, hey, free, like the platforms unite.
Andreas, you have wind noise. Andreas, mute your phone.
You got it.
I think we should try to make a big splash out of this and try to get some news articles written about, like, OpenZFS unites and we have one repo and with a bunch of asterisks about the other platforms or whatnot. But at least to make to send a positive message about achieving this goal, which I think is pretty awesome.
It would be nice.
I think probably the right.
May I ask a question there?
It would be nice if the news coverage didn't make it seem like we weren't still here, if possible. Just as an aside.
Yeah, like to acknowledge Lumosa's continuing role. Is that?
Well, just that we still ship software would be a nice vibe to send.
On the other platforms, who do I ask questions to, generally?
Sorry, what do you mean? Like,
if we were to go down the road where OS X and Windows would also be included in the repo, I have looked at the build files and so on, and there are just the occasional question where to put things and so on. So who do I talk to about that and where?
I think the OpenZFS Slack might be the easiest place to get hold of people.
Yeah, I was hoping that Brian would.
Yeah.
Or the mailing list.
Okay, good.
Presumably there would be.
So a question related to that is, do all of the major ports, OS ports, have representatives on the OpenZFS developer list? I believe they do, but I don't know the Windows guys. I assume they're there.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Jorgen is.
I'm probably the only one at the moment.
Have you seen any NetBSD activities? He's been pulling from FreeBSD.
I haven't. Do you know who's doing that work?
I will get his name while on the call. Just one sec. Go ahead. Continue.
I think we laid out the tree such that we would like to include everybody who wants to get building on their platform. So if it's a matter of where to put the files in the tree, work it out in a pull request or on the mailing list or Slack or whatever.
Yeah, it was also the fact that the OS X is different in that the AutoConf builds the kernel module as well, and it didn't look like it was sort of ready to branch out to do that, whereas at the moment it only builds Linux, I think.
Yeah, I think the FreeBSD changes we were talking about before improve that situation, but maybe not. If not, maybe there's some more work that we need to be done there. But I think we would like it to build for everybody.
Right. I think the FreeBSD just calls their make system and then starts, whereas,
Right. So for the way it works currently is when you're running the configure, you set profile or something to user space, and then and then when you gmake and it uses the AutoConf stuff, it builds everything except for the kernel module. And then under module, there's a makefile.bsd that uses BSD make instead of GNU make and just compiles the kernel module.
I think Matt fixed that. It'll actually just build everything. The configure will just set up the make files such that it will cd into the directory and do the right thing, which was a relief.
Yeah.
Cool. So just to kind of circle back to the timing of this, I think that we should at least wait until this is, well, I think probably the right time is when this integrates into the current repo. And because at that point, it's like everybody's working on the same repo. Like if you're making changes to FreeBSD, you make changes to the repo, and they're immediately part of the next gen FreeBSD ZFS. I mean, it might not, even if it's still not the default in a shipping FreeBSD, it's like that's what all the developers are working on, whether they're FreeBSD developers or Linux developers. So I think that we should try to, get that to happen as soon as possible, but kind of hold off on making any announcements or changing the names of anything until then, so that we can kind of maximize the splash and also kind of maximize the naming matching with what is the actual reality of developers working on the ground.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
Seems reasonable.
There may, yeah. I mean, there may be some logistical issues too. We need to think through about renaming the repos. I'm not exactly sure what GitHub allows for changing the names or which organization it should be in or all those things. Like,
yeah, it should be possible. I mean, in ZFS, you could just do a clone from the current ZFS on Linux, and then it would keep all of the history, and you wouldn't have to really rename the repo. It would make it easy to push and pull at least from there.
Yeah.
And then, people could just start checking it out from OpenZFS rather than from ZFS on Linux, but you wouldn't lose, all of the old links and stuff like that.
Well, you can change ownership of a repository, and I think that GitHub will, at least through one ownership change or renaming, maintain like redirect links for all those things, conceivably.
Yeah, I mean, but Git is symmetrical, right? So it doesn't matter which was the original and which was the...
Well, I think the goal, the tricky part is with all the stuff that's not literally in the repo, like all the issues, all the pull requests, having that move over smoothly.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
There's some like auxiliary website that's generated, that's hosted on GitHub and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There's people who track forks of the project too on GitHub, right? And right now, it'd be nice to be able to transfer all those forks automatically. I don't know if that's possible, but
we'll Brian and I will research that, and I think that's a pretty technical thing that we can just drill down on, and then we'll, in a couple months we'll come back with the specific proposal and pros and cons. But the overall idea of like we're changing the name and like the nitty-gritty of how exactly we accomplish that, I think, is not ultra critical. Cool. Sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
Nope, nothing. I got nothing to add.
I was just gonna hijack your meeting and see if we're ready to move on to the next item.
By all means.
Okay, cool. Well, it sounds like we have two exciting announcements of recently merged long-standing giant projects. So the encryption landing in Illumos, I guess, as we spoke, and then redacted send and receive landing into Linux, I think yesterday or last week. So congratulations to everybody who worked on that. Jorgen for the kicking off the Illumos stuff and doing about 1,000 merges from ZFS on and Paul for keeping the redacted send receive stuff going. Hopefully we'll discover a bunch of interesting use cases that kind of extend from what we originally designed it for. Any questions about those? Party. All right. Brian, do you want to continue leading to the next items?
I can. I was going to hand off to Tom here if we wanted to talk about this a little bit. We'd been talking, the issues come up about maybe improving some of the error reporting to users we do in ZFS at the moment. We've had a couple issues come through where some of the error nodes that are reported from the IAC tools end up being a little confusing when they bubble up to users about exactly what's being reported. So I know Tom wanted to talk about that a little bit. Are you here, Tom?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. My webcam is not working, and I was very much hoping my microphone was. Anyway, so basically, I've kind of been seeing some like patterns in the code, just especially since like encryption has been merged and people are starting to hit like errors that, you know, we test and we've made sure that like that errors are being thrown correctly. But sometimes the error message that gets given to the user has not been correct. This is particularly true with the send and receive code. And in general, the reason for this seems to be that, like from a 10,000 foot perspective, not, you know, just looking at individual cases. I think a big summary of the reason why we have some of these cases like this is because our errors generally return very general error messages like e-inval, you know, e-no-ent, e-exists, something like that. And then we take that and attempt to figure out what exactly actually went wrong based on a whole bunch of context that user space has. And sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. For some of the very, very like general ones, so for instance, like lots of functions in the kernel, I believe I just did a grep through the code yesterday for set error e-inval, and you end up with something like 600 you know, cases where somebody throws e-inval. And that's probably good because that just means that we're checking, you know, users' input whenever we get anything from user space. But we don't have enough error messages to match up with all of the situations that that came from that. What I would like to talk about today is, one of the things that has come up since then is we've had the ZFS error nose, which allow for much more specific error codes in general. So I don't have them in front of me right now, but I know that, for instance, I created one for specifically indicating that when you're doing a raw send, that is an incremental, that your encryption IV GUIDs don't match up, which is like a very specific one, and then I can print an error message which is very specific to what happened there. But I think that maybe what we would want to look at, and what I wanted to talk about today was if we wanted to look towards moving to something a little more general, something like basically being able to have the kernel actually return strings to user space. And we kind of have some of this infrastructure set up already. All of the new IOCTLs return NB lists, which can contain strings, and are all already set up to do that. Basically what I'm getting at is, so for instance, there's an error case which kind of keeps sticking in my mind, which is removing a slog. When you remove a slog, you need to make sure that all of the data sets have completely clean ZILs. But how does the user know which data sets actually do have clean ZILs? Right now, they just get an e-busy, and we interpret that and say, hey, you have a data set somewhere that needs to be unmounted. But what would be really neat is if, as the kernel is going through here, it can find a data set that says, hey, this is not, you know, this particular data set is wrong, and then actually give that string back to user space and say, this is the data set or the list of data sets that you need to actually, you know, that you need to mount and to correct the issue. And I'm just kind of thinking if we had something like that that was kind of generalized and like a general mechanism for returning these errors, that could solve a lot of like user confusion that comes up. I think as developers, we're aware of a lot of like some of the kind of caveats of like, well, this code works really well, but it has this one caveat where it can't do this very particular thing for this very particular reason. And, you know, we can't explain all of that in the man page, and people don't always read the man pages. In general, they just want to read what, you know, they want to know what to do next when they hit an issue. That's my monologue. Sorry for taking a long time, but that's kind of what I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of cases where we're trying to turn the error node back using some context in user space to what the problem actually was, and oftentimes there's a weird case that ends up with an error message telling you that, you know, that pool doesn't exist, or that pool already exists when you weren't doing anything on a pool, and it's like, what?
Yeah, I think that the very, very simple thing that we can and should do is continue to extend the ZFS error node which is basically just like new values that we can return for Airno through the dev.zfs iactls, and that will allow us to like specify like which specific error it is and keep inventing new types of errors. The problem that it doesn't necessarily solve is like returning additional information back up about which thing it was that encountered the error.
I think having a generic mechanism for that kind of additional information would be really useful because there's lots of cases where only the kernel knows exactly, what exact error or data set had the problem, right? So you may not be able to divine that from user space, no matter how specific the Airno is.
And basically, like from this is kind of the analog to the ZFS aux error function that we have, which allows you to attach an auxiliary error along with the generic like error code. Because a lot of times that is usually the thing that actually will tell the user what to do and what actually went wrong. And then like the error code will just end up printing something really, really generic that's not super useful.
Yeah, and that's all userland stuff.
That's all in user. So this would be like the kernel land equivalent of that kind of mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely imagine a whole bunch of different ways that we could manage that in the kernel, right? And one is kind of similar to that. It could be like, you'd be way down in the depths of the kernel, and you call something that like records the additional error information onto something that's like associated with this thread or with the iactl somehow, and then like way up when we're about to return from the iactl, it like copies that out to userland. Or it could be something like, we're way down there, we construct a Airno struct, and then it has to get passed all the way up through everyone.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't know if I know we use thread-specific data for some things related to this, and I know thread-specific data can be relatively slow, but I know we already use it for like history and things like this. The zpool history recording stuff is kind of very much based on thread-specific data, at least in ZFS on Linux, or whatever we're going to call it now, once it has FreeBSD built in. But in the ZFS ioctl.c file, it's all based on just like thread-specific data, saving like the context of what's going on. So I feel like we could either latch on to that mechanism and add this to that, or we could invent something new. I don't know, some kind of just like list in the SPA that's like, that associates PIDs with error messages. I don't know, something like that could work as well. And then just when ioctl returns, it gets rid of it. Or the on-exit handlers that we also have, at least in Linux. I don't know if these are just like some ideas. I don't have a specific implementation in mind or one that I'm, one that I'm supporting, but I just think that something like this would be good.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's a bunch of discussion on the Zoom chat along these lines for anybody who has not opened that window. There's a little chat button at the bottom of the window if you haven't seen it.
Oh yeah, we never use it.
Oh.
I have a question. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Christian.
Yeah.
Is the goal of this change to improve, or is the plan to improve error messages that are presented to users, or is it also targeting better programmatic error handling? Because right now we have to resort to screen scraping everything.
Yeah.
I think it would be both, for sure.
Yeah, I think we'd probably want to do it in two parts. Like you were saying before, Matt, about extending the existing ZFS Airnos. We should have those be specific to particular errors, right? And then the additional strings are for user consumption.
So we would basically be committing this to be a stable interface of the ZFS kernel module.
Or
I would think so.
libzfs core, right? I mean,
yeah, it would basically be libzfs core, or I mean, on Linux at least, the kernel interface is also basically committed. But libzfs core is just like a small wrapper around that.
Yeah, although we do have a comment at the top of that file that says this is not committed.
Yeah.
We should probably make a decision on that at some point, but that's a different discussion.
So this is actually news to me that the ZFS on Linux kernel module interface is a committed interface, because I'm looking at implementing an alternative to libzfs core, mostly for fun, but it's also a nice exercise.
I think it's committed as an artifact of not being able to have the packages in user space in the kernel line up, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's kind of it's a specific type of commit. It's not saying that we're never going to change anything ever. It's more like
there have to be some overlap.
Yeah, like old userland, or actually it's the other way. Like new userland software will continue to work with old kernel software, and kind of do everything that the old kernel can do, but and fail gracefully when you try to do stuff that the old kernel can't do, but the new userland can. I think that's kind of the goal, but I think we would definitely reserve the option of like having it also fail gracefully at doing some other, some things if you end up in that mismatched environment.
I think that's a little. I think this is a little bit of a different discussion though, because I mean, I think we could talk for another long while about committed interfaces.
Yeah, that's different than the error handling thing.
Yep.
So I think like Tom, folks agree that we should do this. Is this something that you want to work on, or that you want to like help provide input on, or what?
I definitely would at least want to be part of the development process. Perhaps I could do the whole thing. I'd need to run this, by, my boss at least, and just make sure that this is something. I think this is something that we would support here at Datto, because I know at least a lot of our admins get very confused by some of the error messages that come through. And so if we could build a generic way of returning better error messages and then use that to fix some of the really common ones, I think that would probably be. I think I could probably argue enough to get time for that. At the moment, though, the next project that I was supposed to be committed to was sequential rebuilds for as part of the D-RAID stuff. That was going to be my next major project. So I'm not sure about what order we want to get to that in. And if somebody has more free time than me, then somebody could take one of them, I could take the other. It doesn't really matter to me which, but just that's what my time looks like at the moment.
Cool. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Richard, do you want to talk about the pyzfs?
Yeah, sure. It's actually a good segue to this conversation. So as anyone who's written code to either gather statistics or build an appliance or some other control plane fanciness knows, there's not a really good interface for getting, for example, the zpool config information in a nice parsable way. And so there's been a couple of, basically everybody ends up rolling their own. I could go through a bunch of examples, but a lot of people end up rolling their own, which is how do we take that NV list from the config and expand it into something that then is usable for automation. And to that end, we began a conversation with some folks who were looking for telemetry information that's available in the zpool config NV list, and how to get that into an environment such as Python. So these guys like Python, and so that started down that path. And so the PR came in this morning. And basically, it's an extension to the pyzfs work that was done at Cluster HQ, but without the restriction of interfacing to libzfs core. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Cluster HQ, who is no longer an ongoing concern, but they wrapped Python or built a Python library wrapper so they could do their automation into the libzfs core. So that, it's creating file systems, creating snapshots, getting properties, all the usual stuff we do in the ZFS command. And so that's then contributed into the ZFS on Linux source code. It's in the contrib directory. You'll find it there. And basically, it allows you to link a Python program to libzfs core, and then use native Python dictionaries instead of NVList, and do all the right thing, and basically allows you to make automation pretty easy. So we were discussing about all that, and basically it comes to the point where for some of the things we need both for telemetry as well as just overall systems management, getting to the ZFS or the pool configuration in VList is useful. So I know we've had many discussions of this over the years of how to make that consistent and everything, and this is just one more of those discussions. But the good news is we have a pull request then that we can settle on to refer to that, to the efforts by these guys. So
I have a comment to make. I didn't make it earlier in the GitHub thread, but you realize this is the second well-supported pylibzfs.
There's at least two others.
They have their own, but it's based on Python.
Yeah, I think there's a few others around. I think this gets reinvented. This wheel gets reinvented a lot. Actually.
Yes, that's part of the thing we would like to avoid in the future with a unified OpenZFS.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I'm thinking this is a good project to target that, actually, to tie together today's conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously having it in the repo helps there to not be more proliferation of alternate implementations, even if it's in the contrib directory.
Well, kind of generically, I guess it's a question for Brian. How have we handled contrib, ZFS on Linux contrib pieces in the past? Is there any policy?
If it seems like useful functionality and we can support it and test it, we've been have allowed that kind of stuff into the contrib directory. We felt at the time that this was the best spot for it, but it doesn't. If we want to make it a full-fledged thing that's supported everywhere, I mean, it could be moved out of the contrib directory. We have tried very hard to keep it updated when new features get landed. Right, we make sure functionality gets added. To exercise that functionality. So anything that goes into libzfs core, we've tried to add here. We've tried to restrict it to libzfs core for the moment, just because it's a stable interface. So I guess there's a question of, do we want to extend beyond that stable interface? It sounds like the intent here is to do that.
So I'm thinking, I'm really thinking, should we consider a path of getting the config and vlist into libzfs core? What do you guys think of sort of making that more stable?
I mean, we can definitely add something to retrieve it. I don't in terms of stability, it seems like due to the user kernel issues on Linux, we have an incentive to keep it more or less stable, at least according to the newer stuff should be able to read older stuff, and therefore we don't want to change it very often. But I mean, I don't think that we want to say that it's never going to change.
Right.
But it seems like we wouldn't be changing it flagrantly, like without a good reason.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
I think that makes sense. And
it's also not like it's not like great, it's not a clean or great kind of thing, but it gets the job done.
Yeah, and I think we've discussed in the past as well as creating something that is more friendly. For those who aren't familiar with this particular piece of the code, some of the structures that get passed show up in the NV list as an array of uint64s.
And you just have to know the first thing is this, and the second thing is that, and the third thing is the other.
Exactly, and that as we made changes, it has to go in lockstep, or else things get, you'll end up with the wrong data in the wrong column, so to speak. So
is this a case?
Yeah.
Sorry, is this a case where libzfs common could just express a subset of the data that's available, and it would satisfy most of the use cases, and the things that are not, generally used, or may not be terribly useful in most cases, just is not available, or it's only there if you pass a, give me all the data and it might be wrong flag?
Yeah, so kind of one of the attempts we made at this a while back, a couple of lives ago, is we took that NV list and then created another NV list that was, transformed those arrays into key values. And then the key would remain, even though the location in the array of the value may change over time. So it's more stable that way. And then it's just a matter of agreeing on what the key names should be and what they are. I think that's the best way to decouple those structs from a management nightmare. Right, because otherwise, anytime we change, one of those structures, somebody will pick it up and then we'll forget to add it to pyzfs, and there won't be any testing, and hilarity will ensue. So I want to avoid that process. So maybe the best approach in the short term is take a look at doing a human-friendly NV list for the zpool config and add that to libzfs core. How's that sound?
Yeah, I think that's essentially what I was suggesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good approach.
Is the main interest here in the pool config, or are there other things we should be thinking about?
Well,
is it the pool config, just the part that's stored on disk, or also the pool config that contains the additional stats that we pass up to userland?
Yeah, it's the additional stats.
Like the VDEV error counts and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I see.
So it's all right there. It's easy to grab. I mean, zpool status does it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
We know how to do this. We have code we can copy. It's really a matter of making it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one way that we could go is to say, hey, what we really need is a programmatic zpool status, and we just say, hey, everything that's in zpool status needs to be retrievable from, a programmatic real committed interface, whether it's a pool property or some other thing. And whenever you add new stuff to zpool status, it has to go into somewhere else too, so that it can be used programmatically. I don't know if that 100% solves your problem, but it would probably go a long ways. But it's a lot more work than just saying, yeah, go ahead and use the config.
Yeah, I remember we discussed this before with as part of one of the things zpool per VDEV properties could do, is being able to get things like those error counters and the health of each member of each VDEV and so on, where you could just do like zpool get health of pool name, VDEV name, and have it return.
Yeah.
I think I have most of that in a branch somewhere. I have to find that and rebase it on the new repo and push that so that people can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the good news is it is an NV list. Right, that's the good news. So it can be extended.
I think as an architectural rule, anything you can see in a human-centric command should definitely be a property somewhere. And having a generic mechanism for doing that makes it easier to make that a hard rule, I think, for the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a mistake that we made very early on with zpool status.
Yeah. The other thing that people have done, and I know the C-Store guys have done this as well, is do the take joins print NV list JSON and just print that guy out. But again, it's not very friendly to programmers.
Well, and it's, the shape of the inside of the thing can change too. So
yeah,
because you've got two things, right? You've got the pipe to get the data could be committed without committing the thing that comes through the pipe.
Yeah, which is like only grammatical.
I mean, it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
Like the committing to the pipe would at least probably mean that you'd be able to like stably build and link against the library, say, and then just carry a bunch of translation code around for the different contents. Would be better than also having to privately rebuild the thing constantly. Would be, I mean, from a release engineering perspective anyway, I think would be at least a step forward.
So would libzfs core be the place to land that translation?
The translation from
the production of the stable NV list that is a subset of the real NV list?
Yeah.
Is that what your question is?
Yeah.
I think that seems pretty reasonable. You were saying that the current stability stuff is that newer versions of userland continue to work without having rebooted to the newer kernel module.
Yeah, which is like a pretty late requirement.
So you could use
that seems backwards to me.
You could include new translations, but keep the old ones, and that would be fine.
Yeah.
In the library, that is.
Yeah. Yeah, you could do that.
Okay, so to wrap that up, then there is a PR. I think we should take the different approach of doing that translation in libzfs core, and then that'll make the PR actually simpler because they won't have to do all the other wrappings.
You'd be able to use it from Rust and other things as well, which would be good.
Yeah. Rust is picking up steam for sure.
I guess we're out of time, but I was wondering if we should be doing it in libzfs core versus in the kernel. But I guess we can take that offline.
I don't know the answer yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about, I guess, if we ignore like backwards compatibility and that kind of stuff, then it seems better to do it in the kernel. But maybe doing it in userland lets us have more of this cross-compatibility stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. There was one more thing on the agenda. It was more of a question. I'll try to follow up with the Wirara, hopefully I pronounced that right, about spanning mode. So cool. Thanks everyone. And let's see. Next meeting. I think next meeting is the earlier time.
Yeah, I'll move it. It's currently at whatever the 13th or something. I'll move it to the 20 or the 16th. I'll move it to the 23rd and make it 11 a.m. Pacific.
Cool. So next meeting, July 23rd, 11 a.m. Pacific.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.